In this video, we'll be taking a look at outputting your renders and cameras. Maya has built-in 4 different cameras. Orthogonal cameras, the top, front, and side, are your typical modeling and work windows. And your perspective view, which moves around in 3D space quite nicely. Now, the perspective view is, in fact, a camera, but I typically like to use the perspective view solely for navigating in my scene and getting around my objects. Let's go ahead and open up in our lighting project scenes folder, Still Life version 4. This is the familiar still life of fruit. I'll go ahead and turn off the wireframe on the display, and we'll go to 7 mode so we can see how our lighting is. Now, the perspective view is indeed a camera. However, I really want to navigate the scene with it, so I want to create a rendering view with this scene. One thing I can do is go into one of my panels and click on Panels, Perspective. If I click on PERSP, Persp, that'll just give me the same view as I already have in this panel. However, if I go Panels, Perspective, New, I'll get a new camera. This will be called Perspective 1. In the channel box, I hit Control A, or that would be Command A on a Macintosh. I'm going to, with the newly created camera, Persp 1 selected, I'm going to click on its name in the attribute editor, and I'm going to call this Ren Cam, short for render camera. In the attribute editor, by pressing Control A or Command A, I'll go ahead and take a look at some of the attributes available to us. The camera lens is perhaps one of the more important features of the camera. If I change the focal length, that essentially changes the view. The longer the focal length, the more I zoom into my scene. This is not the same as moving the camera as I do with the Alt and right mouse button combinations. This dollies your camera into and out of the scene, physically moving the actual camera. The focal length, changing the focal length, changes the zoom factor. And what this does is it also changes the angle of view. Moving the camera and zooming the lens are two optically different things altogether. The field of view and the sense of perspective changes when you change the focal length. With a short lens, let's say an 8mm focal length, your subject becomes almost like a fisheye, becomes very wide angle. The sense of perspective is very exaggerated, and objects seem to be a lot further away than they actually are. If we take a look at the top of this pedestal, we'll see that corner to corner, this seems like a much further distance than it actually is. If I go back to the default 35mm, you'll see that that distance is shortened. So let's go to 200mm. The longer your lens, the flatter the distance will seem. It shortens the feeling of depth in the perspective. Now let's go ahead and find ourselves a nice focal length, and let's go to about a 16mm lens. As you can see, 16mm, the camera's quite far away from the objects and everything looks really small. It's just like an actual regular camera. If you put a 200mm lens on your SLR, you'll zoom into your scene. And you can afford to be far away from your object. Let's go back to the 16, which means you have to move up close and personal with the still life. And let's find a somewhat pleasing composition with the camera. Now I'm using the Alt and mouse button combinations that we've come to be familiar with in Maya to position the camera. However, if I go to a different view, let's say the perspective view, I can see the camera like an actual regular object. If I have both the windows open, I can manipulate the camera just like any other object. As a matter of fact, if I go into the channel editor by toggling Control A or Command A, you can see that it has familiar translate, rotate, and scale. Scale really doesn't matter so much with cameras. That only changes the size of the camera in the view. Doesn't really do much. It's actually best to keep a camera scale set to 1. You can inadvertently create some render artifacts if you have strange scales on your camera. So it's maybe a bit of voodoo and a bit of superstition, but I always like to keep the scale for my cameras at 1. But I can certainly move my camera like any other object on these axes, and I can rotate that as well. And this may make it a little bit easier for me to place my composition as I like without having to use the Alt and mouse buttons. I can get a little bit more precise with my movements on the camera. Let's go ahead and move that a little bit more and get that just right. Once we have a pleasing composition, the camera is all set. And what I traditionally like to do once I have my composition is to lock the camera in place, because it's all too easy to go into the panel and start moving around and your camera position is lost. If that does happen in that panel, simply press the left bracket key on your keyboard. That's the one to the right of your P key, and that will allow you to undo and redo camera moves, only camera moves. The left undoes and the right bracket redoes your camera move. Let's undo that with the left bracket and go back to the channel box. I will highlight the movement and rotation attributes and right click, and then I will choose lock selected. This will turn the attributes gray in the channel box and will make it impossible for me to accidentally mess up my camera. Furthermore, when you look at the object, the manipulators are turned gray for movement and rotation. This type of locking is available for any object in Maya, but extremely useful for cameras. Now let's unclutter our view a little bit. We'll go into Show and we'll turn off Light View, so it's a little bit easier to see the camera. This camera is a single node camera. It was created through the panels, New, Perspective. However, you can also create a camera through the Create menu by going to Create Cameras. This is the type of camera that we've created by going through the panel. There are two different types of cameras that you can create. Camera and aim is the next most popular type of camera. Let's go ahead and create one of those as well in the scene. Camera 1 is within a group called Camera 1 group, and there are 2 nodes to that camera. It's also called a 2-node camera. There's a camera node, and there's an aim node. The camera node is much like our regular camera node that we've already created. However, it has rotate X, Y, and Z with a cyan color for the channel box. This means that there's a constraint on those channels for that object. And that constraint always makes the camera point to the aim object. The aim object, when moved, will make the camera move with it. When you move the camera itself, it will continue to point at that aim. So in another window, you can very easily manipulate the aim to rest it directly on your composition. Let's go ahead and choose Panels, and we'll go to Camera 1. This is our aim camera. To make it a little bit easier, I'm going to actually name it Aim Cam. Now aim cam, if we select it and we'll move it about, you can see how it's affecting. Let's go ahead and turn the wireframe off. We can see this better, and let's hide our lights temporarily from that view. Now moving my camera just like a regular camera. However, it's always going to point at its aim, which is this little pink dot right in the middle of the frame. So this camera is manipulated just like the single node camera. As a matter of fact, if I select it and open its attribute editor, it has focal length, just like before. This time, let's go to a 24mm lens. We'll want to get a little bit closer. We'll rotate around. Let's go into the perspective view, and let's use the 2 nodes to move that camera around until we get the composition that we're looking for. And let's move the aim just a little bit more. And there we go. And that is the 2-point camera. The last camera we have in Maya is the 3-point camera, which is also known as camera aim and up. Camera aim and up, again, comes in a group. In that group is the camera and the aim, but it has an additional locator called the up axis. Let's select the whole group of that camera. Let's move that whole group up so we can see everything nice and tidy. The aim, just like you've seen, controls the aim of the camera. The camera itself controls its position. However, you'll notice that it has a tilt now. And that is the up direction, and that controls the tilt of the camera. All the cameras are the same. They have focal length. All the attributes are exactly the same. However, the 2 additional cameras we looked at have an additional aim and an up. In this video, we took a look at Maya cameras and the difference between a single node, a 2-node camera, and a 3-node camera.